Hello, my name is Elizabeth St.John, and I'd like to welcome you to Historic Heroines, a lecture series presented by the Friends of Lydiard Park. And it's about the women of Lydiard who not only lived through some very extraordinary historic events, but perhaps had a hand themselves in influencing the outcome. So I'm welcoming here today on our Zoom presentation. We were hoping that we could do this live, but of course, travel precluded us from doing that this year. But I hope perhaps one day you'll join us at Lydiard for some further presentations when we all are able to gather together again. I'm going to share my screen. You might notice a slight lag as my photographs go through, but I promise that I will keep up with them and make sure that I don't go too fast and that we conquer the technology that is bringing us together today. So again, Historic Heroines, and it's from, of course, the Friends of Lydiard Park that I've been a proud member of for many years. And I'm going to forward this to the next slide, and there we go. So the subject of this talk is a woman called Lucy St.John. She was born at Lydiard in the late 1500s, and she is the subject of my novel, The Lady of the Tower. I've been writing a trilogy, and have just finished it actually, about these extraordinary women of Lydiard who lived 400 years ago. And it's a series of novels called Chronicles. Today we're going to talk about, as I say, Lucy St.John, who is the Lady of the Tower. I came across Lucy's story very accidentally in a notebook that was hidden away in Nottingham Castle. And it was actually a notebook written by her daughter, Lucy Apsley Hutchinson. Lucy Hutchinson was the wife of Colonel Hutchinson, who was a parliamentarian during England's Civil War. And she was determined to keep a notebook or notebooks all the way through the war, and later on wrote a memoir of her husband's life. And within that was this extraordinary biographical fragment of her mother's life, and her Lucy St.John, who was born at and it was an extraordinary story. As a writer, I couldn't have wished more interesting. It was a beautiful young girl who was orphaned at an early age and had a wicked stepmother and a sister that was jealous of her, a broken affair. But what intrigued me more than anything was this woman married the keeper of the Tower of London and spent 13 years living within the tower, not as a prisoner, but as the keeper's wife. So today we're going to explore her life and go behind the walls of the Tower of London and talk a bit about what her life was like when she lived there. For those of you who are familiar with Lydiard and have been to St. Mary's Church, you may have seen this extraordinary portrait of the 6 Lady St.Johns, the 6 St.John sisters who were alive during Lucy's time. She is the youngest. She's the one on the far left there. And when I was putting together the outline for my story and my novels, I decided to focus just on 4 of the sisters. They all had extraordinary lives. And for me, that was the way to really bring the story together of life of this extraordinary family. So let's talk a little bit about Lucy's journey to the tower and how it got there. And perhaps all the areas within the tower that those of you who've been there would be familiar with today that still existed in Lucy's time. If you travel to the tower, you get off at the tube station, you cross here and into this bottom area where the lovely green lawns are, of course, was the original moat of the Tower of London. So you'd walk past that and into the Bywood Gate here and go past, I don't know if you can see my cursor, just the tops of these roofs right here. And that was Lucy's house within the Tower of London. And we're going to explore a little bit more about her house. And then we're going to look at 3 of the towers themselves that were jails, effectively. And that's the Blood, which is right here. And then all the way over in the bottom left, the Martin Tower. And then back over to the entrance here, the Bell Tower. When Lucy lived in the tower, she would have recognized, or a lot, or if she'd come back and out, she would still recognize a lot of the places, the iconic tower, of course, and this whole ramparts all the way around. So not much has changed in all the years that have passed since she lived there. I love this illustration. This is an artist's rendering of how London Bridge may have looked in Lucy's time. As you can see, it was covered in houses and shops and pubs, I'm sure, bursting at the seams. But what was fascinating, of course, is that it actually sat on all these pontoons, which forced the currents of the Thames through these narrow apertures, which really created enormous noisy rapids, highly fast-flowing water. It was actually quite dangerous to try and get a boat through when the tide was running. And at the same time, there were water wheels that were churning, creating, grinding corn. People were fishing. So it was a whole bursting with life. And it was the only crossing by bridge across the Thames at that point. And from that, she would have seen the tower itself. She would have seen this place that she was coming to live in. The iconic White Tower, of course, dating back to William the Conqueror's times. What she wouldn't have seen would be this embankment wall that was built by the Victorians. In Lucy's time, the river would have just lapped right up to the ramparts here themselves. And you can just see the edge in the front here of the Watergate going in, which we know today as Traitor's Gate. That would have allowed the water to flood into the moat, which was built by a Dutchman, not very well, I'm afraid. He didn't actually take into consideration the tides. And so although it filled the moat nicely when the river rose, it didn't empty it too well. And so water got pretty stagnant and pretty smelly there. As Lucy arrived at the tower, again, this would have been in 1617, she would have seen these houses peeking over the ramparts of the tower with the White Tower behind it, and known that this was her house that she was coming into. But in fact, she had to, of course, cross through a few other places to get there. And this is perhaps one of the most famous water gates in the world, Traitor's Gate. Interestingly enough, in Lucy's time, it was actually referred to as Trader's Gate. It was the main access into the tower for all the deliveries that were coming in via the Thames River. It would be unloading on the quay outside and then coming in through this gate. But the name started to slip to Traitor's Gate, late Elizabethan, early Jacobean times, until it became that sort of name of gloom and horror, this Traitor's Gate. And then when Lucy arrived at the tower with her husband, this was her residence. It's actually absolutely beautiful, called the Queen's House. Henry VIII renovated part of this house for Anne Boleyn. She never actually lived in it, but he got it all ready for her. And this is where Lucy lived. It's still the official residence of the Lieutenant Governor of the Tower. It's still his private home. I was very fortunate when I was doing my research for the novel that I was allowed into the residence, under escort, of course, by a beefeater. And it was fascinating to see and to know and to walk into what was effectively Lucy's house 400 years ago. Her view looking out was of Tower Green, which is this big green area in the front here. Unfortunately, she's also looking out directly to the execution block, which is this concrete icon right here. In Lucy's time, there was an orchard over the green, so she would have had hopefully a bit of an obscured view. And there was also a shed on the green itself. That was for those privileged people who wanted to be executed in private, not that they had much choice. Many of them did actually end up, of course, being executed on the execution block itself. So Lucy's home in her time, as you can see, looks very familiar to the current tower. Here's down in the bottom left-hand corner of the complex, her houses. her garden, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit, the shed that I just referred to, and Tower Green, and then the Church of St. Peter ad Vincula, the White Tower itself, and then around the perimeter were the various towers that carried the jails within them. This is a beautiful portrait of Lucy and her son, Alan Apsley. He was about 3 years old when this was painted, so pretty much at the same time that she moved into the tower. And I like to think perhaps her husband, Alan Apsley, had this painted to commemorate the fact that he'd reached this pinnacle of a success, very important and powerful position, and perhaps wanted to celebrate his young family with a portrait. We think it was by Daniel Meitens of the Dutch school, very, very famous and well-respected portrait painter. So Alan certainly put some money into getting this painted. You may be looking at this a little bit puzzled and saying, well, wait a minute, this little boy is wearing a dress. Is it really a boy? It is. In those days, it was pretty much the norm for boys and girls to be dressed the same in dresses up until boys reached the age of 5 or 6, at which point they were breeched and put into their breeches. And there's a lovely little symbol that the painter included. You can't quite see it here, but when you see the portrait in real life, Alan is actually clasping a little pair of red cherries, 2 cherries. And that's, I think, the sign from the portrait painter that he is a boy. So let's talk about Lucy's journey to the tower, how she got there, and then what her life was like when she lived within. So as I said, there were 6 sisters. Lucy was born at Lydiard House. She was born, we think, around 1594, not sure 100%, but probably around that time. But by the time she was 3 years old, her father and mother had died, and she was taken away from Lydiard to grow up with her uncle, who lived in Battersea, in the St. John house in Battersea. But she came back to Lydiard. When her brother reached his majority, he brought all the sisters in the family back together at Lydiard. So effectively, she grew up there from probably around the age of 11. Lydiard didn't look, with that beautiful Palladian front, didn't look like that when Lucy lived there. She would have recognized the back of the house, which for any of you who've been to Lydiard know how marvelous it is that you walk around and see this extraordinary medieval structure at the back. So she would have recognized this area. And from all accounts, it sounded like she had a happy childhood there. She loved gardens and was very, very interested in herbalism and medicinal recipes from plants and so on. And I think she must have really enjoyed the time that she spent at Lydiard. Just a couple of pictures here of actually how the house nestles right up close to the church, where of course all the extraordinary monuments are to the family and where they would have worshipped. As Lucy grew up, court beckoned, and there's a wonderful account within her daughter's memoirs of a broken love affair. Now, it's very discreetly mentioned. She doesn't actually name in the memoirs who he was, but based on the research that I've done, I'm pretty sure it was Theophilus Howard, Earl of Suffolk, and they lived close to Lydiard and were certainly moving in Lucy's circles. And as a historical fiction writer, sometimes you have to take a leap of faith and do as much research as you can and then write some of the fiction around it. I was very happy to say that by the time I'd actually almost completed the book and continued doing the research, I was able to be almost with 100% certainty that Theophilus had actually known the family extremely well, because 2 of his children married 2 of Lucy's sister's children in a future time. So definitely some interactions there. Anyway, Lucy suffered from a broken love affair. He married someone else, and this woman who I'm showing next to him here is his sister, Frances Howard, and we'll hear more of her later. She was part of the plot to marry her brother off to someone who was perhaps more of his social level. because although Lucy came from a well-respected gentry, it was at the level in society that would have been accepted in Francis. And yeah, she was a bit of a witch, actually, if we want to say it aloud. You can tell by her dress there. Lucy went to court. We had an interesting time there. It was an extraordinary to be at court. James I was on the throne, wife Anne absolutely loved parties and masks and all of the entertainments. And Lucy stayed there for a while, but I think began to really decide that it wasn't somewhere that she wanted to stay. And she was well educated and wanted to follow the more Calvinist doctrine of religion. She'd been exposed to that as a young woman and resolved to go back to what was then the center of Calvinism in those days, which was in Guernsey in the Channel Islands, where all the refugees were coming. And she was go back there because her sister-in-law's father was the governor of Guernsey, and he invited her back. So she gave up on court, she on her broken affair, and resolved to spend the rest of her life devoted to the service of God in the Channel Islands. On her way, she stopped off at Castle Fonman in Wales, which is another St. John family home, to say goodbye to her sister. And while she was there, Sir Alan Apsley, who was a good family friend, came to stay upon them and fell in love with Lou and could not leave without proposing to her. So very much a whirlwind romance from our perspective. Certainly they found something together in each other that made a very successful and long-lasting marriage. So Lucy married Sir Alan Apsley. He was at that point Victualler of the Navy, which was a very important position and one that actually required him to put a lot of his own financial resources into the victualling. He would essentially buy all the supplies himself and then get a bond or a note from the king saying he was good for it and then sell them on. So it was an interesting business he was in. And at the same time, he had the opportunity to acquire the office of the Lieutenant of the Tower. Now, in those days, of course, there was no central banking system. You didn't really have a salary for a job. I mean, you had some, but it was very different. And the way you got on in life was through patronage, by having someone who was wealthier and more influential than you take you under their wing or give you specific perks that helped you get on in the world. And Alan was offered the office of the lieutenant, which was very well-paying in many benefits. And he paid the equivalent of $1.5 million for that office. And the reason that he was able to even secure that was that Lucy's sister, Barbara, was married to Edward Villiers, who was master of the Mint, which was also located in the Tower, and he made a whole business out of that. Edward Villiers was the brother of the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, who was the favorite King James of England. So you can see here how it goes on down the line. And James would pretty much give George anything he wanted. George would then redistribute that to his family and thereby bringing actually many of the St. John sisters into a whole new strata of society. So in 1617, Lucy and Alan moved into the Queen's house. Beautiful, beautiful environment. Lucy had her young son and they settled in there. But at the same time, Lucy would have been very much aware that it wasn't just a house, but it was offices, it was the center of business for the Tower. And that in itself was the liberty of the Tower was almost like a small town. It was a few thousand people depended on the Tower for their jobs and for their livelihood. So it was a very, very busy environment. And within that house, Alan would have had his offices. And just an example here, this is the state meeting room that is on the floor above Lucy's parlor. And this is where Alan would have had his meetings with the Tower officials and visiting dignitaries. But it's also a room for interrogation. And Guy Fawkes was interrogated here for his part in the gunpowder plot just a few years before Lucy moved in. So she would have been very much aware of the criminal aspects, the jail, the horror that was going on around her, as well as living there. This is a view actually from Lucy's parlour, looking out across Tower Green. I was very lucky when I was there that I was able to actually explore a little bit in the house that she lived in. And it was a very special moment for me to be able to stand and look out of the window that I knew she'd looked out of as well. As a writer, those are the inspirational moments that you just live for. Lucy, as I said, would have been very conscious of the fact that she was living within a prison. And today we're going to talk about 3 specific prisons within the tower and who lived there and how it may have impacted Lucy's life. You can see right here within the diagram how the prisons are laid out on the whole perimeter of the walls. So we're going to talk about the Martin Tower and the Bloody Tower and the Bell Tower. The Bell Tower was probably one of the most secure prisons within the tower itself, within the whole complex, primarily because you could only get there from the lieutenant's lodging. So this is a picture that I took that's literally going to Lucy's house towards the Bell Tower itself. An extraordinary change of ambience as you leave this beautifully wood-paneled, elegant residence and walk 30 feet down a corridor, and suddenly you're in this incredibly cold, gloomy prison, which has such an ambiance of fear and just no escaping. The bell tower itself is, as I say, that's the only access. It's the first tower you come across as you come into the complex itself, and it's called that because it does have the curfew bell right at the top of the tower itself. Several prisoners that Lucy would have been aware of when she was there that were incarcerated in the bell tower before her time. Sir Thomas More, of course, he was imprisoned there by Henry VIII for refusing to agree to Catherine of Aragon's divorce and the acceptance of Anne Boleyn. And Princess Elizabeth, who was in the tower because her sister, Queen Mary, was very concerned of a Protestant uprising against her, and that people would rally around Elizabeth to put her on the throne instead of Mary. So she incarcerated her in the tower for a while as well. And in the undercroft of the church, St. Peter ad Vincula, there's this beautiful little shrine that's dedicated to Sir Thomas More. The yeoman warders, the beefeaters themselves, have a great affinity with More and his beliefs and his courage. And they have set up this little shrine in the undercroft as a place that they can come and relax and rest and pray and meditate, have some quiet time while they're on duty within the tower. It's a very meaningful, very poignant area there. The next tower that we're going to talk about is the Martin Tower. This is a lovely portrait that I really enjoy. It's Henry Percy, who was the Earl of Northumberland. As a young man, very indolently lying in his book flung to one side. I like how his glove just scattered on the ground there, and he's perhaps daydreaming. He was an interesting, fascinating man, actually had an extraordinary library, which he brought with him into the tower, more of that in a minute. But he was thrown into the tower by James I on the suspicion that he was part of the gunpowder plot, the plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament, by virtue of the fact that he had a very distant relative who was called Thomas Percy, who you can see here in the picture. Despite the fact that Henry Percy, the Earl, said, look, I was supposed to be in Parliament on the day that it was going to be blown up. I really don't think I'd blown myself up. I really had nothing to do with it. King didn't buy that and put him in the Tower of London. And he lived there for many, many years within the Martin Tower. That did not stop him from making him quite at home. He was known as the Wizard Earl, And one of his great joys was the practice of alchemy. And within the tower itself, he was able to continue his alchemy experiments and found a friendly alchemist in his neighbor, Sir Walter Raleigh, who was also in the tower at the latter part of the Wizard Earl's stay there. And he was also interested in alchemy. So together they enjoyed a number of experiments together. And an interesting side note of that is that Lucy actually lent them her hen house in her garden to conduct their experiments in. So I have this lovely vision of Lucy in the kitchen looking out over her garden and seeing the hen hut, you know, having a few explosions coming out of it or smoke coming out of the window as these two extraordinary men looked for gold, never quite found it. This is a representation of the Wizard Earl's rooms within the tower. He made himself very comfortable. You can see he has writing desk, a lovely fireplace, portraits, a mirror. He had 19 servants with him, his entire library. Lots of visitors came to see him and talk to him because he liked to entertain. And for those rainy days when he couldn't go outside, because he was allowed the liberty of the tower, he was allowed to walk around outside. When it was raining, he actually built himself a bowling alley so he could exercise on those days. So an extraordinary man, and definitely one worth reading more about. The third tower that we're talking about today is the Bloody Tower. Certainly the one that has perhaps the most repute within the prisons within the tower complex. In Lucy's time, it was probably still referred to as the Garden Tower. It only became known as the Bloody Tower pretty much during the 1600s. And it was called that actually because of a suicide that took place there, which was a very, very difficult thing for people to accept in those days. And so it became known as the Bloody Tower then. So in Lucy's time, it was called still the Garden Tower. And part of that was because it actually bounded her garden going up to the Queen's house. Here's an interesting twist of fate. If you remember, I talked earlier about Lucy's broken romance with Theophilus Howard and how I felt that it was actually engineered by his sister Frances. Well, she went on to become a woman of most ill repute and was actually incarcerated in the tower while Lucy was there. She was accused and found guilty of murdering Sir Thomas Overbury. She was very jealous of him. He had her husband's affection. She thought that he influenced her husband against her. And so she had him thrown in the tower. Not content with that, she then arranged for poisoned cakes to be delivered to him. And she actually poisoned him with arsenic while he was in there. She was caught and thrown into the jail, into the Bloody Tower, while Lucy was there. So I can just imagine what it must have been like for Lucy to confront this woman again who'd pretty much destroyed her happiness at a young age and was now under her control. And that's another sub-thread that I work through in my book. As a writer, again, you find these stories that are just extraordinary and want to include them in the work that you're doing. And then later, Sir Walter Raleigh was incarcerated in the Bloody Tower. He had been thrown in there several times during his life. And on this final time before he died, he was there for basically failing to find the gold of El Dorado. He put together a whole business proposal to James, absolutely was convinced that he would find the gold, sailed to South America, and unfortunately came home empty-handed. And sadly, his son, who he absolutely adored, died on that voyage too. Determined not to come home completely empty-handed, Raleigh then pirated the King of Spain's ships on his last leg home. And unfortunately, the King of Spain didn't take too kindly to that and insisted that Raleigh not only be imprisoned, but executed. I think that must have been a really hard time for Lucy and Alan, because Raleigh was a family friend. He was someone that Alan was very close to. And so they did the best that they could to make his living conditions within the tower comfortable for him. and Alan escorted him on his final journey to Whitehall, where he was executed. So again, just incredibly hard times for them to live through. As I had mentioned to you, Raleigh and the Earl were both keen alchemists and gardeners. And Lucy's garden within the Tower of London would have been stocked with medicinals and herbs, and it would have been where she would have gone to secure the recipes for working with her prisoners. She was responsible for their health, and it was up to her. And the daughter has a wonderful quote within her book that she looked after her prisoners with the kindness of a mother. It was up to her to really ensure that they were well taken care of. And some of her recipes, I firmly believe, have shown up in Lady Joanna St. John's recipe book, which was written by her niece and is now on display at the Wellcome Foundation in London, which is a pharmaceutical museum. So extraordinary recipes, and I was able to feature many of them in my book, which I enjoyed very much. And then last year, the Tower put in a token garden between the Bloody Tower and Lucy's residence to show where the garden was originally, and put in some of the original herbs and so on that Lucy would have planted. Just as we finish up here, a glimpse at Raleigh's apartments within the Tower. They've pretty much put them together as they would have been when he lived there. And a glance of how he would have exercised. He was allowed to walk out on what they call the leads, which is the walkway at the top of the ramparts. And you can see here the view looking over towards the bell tower, which he would have exercised. And this little sketch is a fairly new addition to the Bloody Tower's history. They were doing some renovations there a year or so ago. And when they peeled back the plaster, they actually found this child sketch underneath. And if you look at it closely and compare it to some of the portraits of Raleigh, you will see a very strong resemblance. And they carbon dated it and actually found that it dated to the time that he was within the Tower. So they think it was a self-portrait. They think perhaps bored one day or wanted to leave a memento that he'd been in the Bloody Tower and left this portrait. So just to summarize again, the people, the stories. We talked about Lucy St. John, the sixth daughter, the youngest daughter of the St. John sisters from Lydiard. And then we talked about Lucy Hutchinson, her daughter, who was the biographer who married a parliamentarian who was also a regicide. He actually signed the king's death warrant during the Civil War. And Lucy's son, Alan, the little that we saw in the dress in that portrait, grew up to be a royalist soldier and fought against his sister and her husband in the Civil War. And I covered that in my second book, in By Love Divided, which is a fascinating story to research about how a family was divided during the Civil War and yet still looked after each other and maintained that love for each other. And Lucy, I'm happy to say, lived a long life, definitely one of extraordinary hardship as well as happiness. And it's been fascinating following her life and doing the research and publishing those. So I'm going to stop right now and say thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed very much learning about the Lady of the Tower and Lydiard and the St. John sisters, my historic home for sure. And on behalf of the Friends of Lydiard Park, I'd like to thank you again for your interest. There's a lot more information on our website, and you can certainly reach out, ask any questions, contact us. We are deep into the research as well as enjoying the beauty of the house and the park and the museum there as well. So again, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you perhaps one day at Lydiard. Thank you.